We're continuing in our series through 1 Peter called The Outsiders, and Peter is talking to Christians about living out their faith in what is an increasingly hostile culture. As we've studied, Nero has taken power at this point, and so these Christians are beginning to experience, more severe levels of persecution. In the past, they had been marginalized and ostracized. They're kind of just a small group of people, but now they were being physically persecuted, suffering physically for their faith, and Peter wants them to know how to respond. Right? Because it's human instinct to respond to opposition with opposition, right? I mean, when someone comes against us, we come against them. There's this instinct to want to fight. Peter knows that all too well, right? I mean, he was known for being impulsive and for acting on the emotion of the moment. And Peter says, look, take it from a guy who pulled out a sword and cut off an ear when Jesus was arrested. Don't be impulsive about this. Let's be intentional about how we're going to respond when we face pressure, when we face persecution. How are we going to respond in those moments? And so as we've studied in this series in 1 Peter, Peter reminds the Christians that, look, it starts with knowing who you are, that you're not citizens of earth, you're citizens of heaven. That you're foreigners, living out your time in a foreign land, that you're on this journey. He calls them exiles. You're just passing through. And if you can remember that, if you can remember, look, our hope is not in this world, our hope is in heaven, then no matter what you go through in this world, you're like, oh, it's all right, it's temporary, it's short, a little turbulence on the flight, but this isn't our destination. That perspective makes all the difference. And he says to us that our lives should be marked with this joy and gladness because of it. That even in the midst of suffering, we can have this joy, we can have a spirit of peace because our hope is in heaven. And our hope does not, he says, spoil, diminish, or fade. It is kept secure for us. And see, Peter knows that as foreigners, as people who are not natives, that there's going to be this temptation to kind of just go along with what everybody else says, what everybody else believes, to kind of soften our convictions and water down our beliefs. And so Peter has talked to us about this already. Don't conform. Don't just be baked into the mold of culture. Don't just believe what everyone else believes because they're believing it. Don't just do what everyone else does because they're doing it. Don't do that. Instead, he challenges us to live out our convictions. In chapter 3, he gives us some practical ways that we do that. But the underlying message is that, look, the Word of God is our authority, not the world we live in. And so here's the way Peter talks about this in 1 Peter chapter 1, 24 and 25. People are like grass. Their beauty is like a flower in the field. The grass withers and the flower fades. But the word of the Lord remains forever, right? So people and their opinions and their ideas and their thoughts, it's like grass. Yeah, it grows, and then it dries up and it blows away, and then somebody else has a different opinion, a different thought, a different idea, a different value, a different belief, and if you've studied history, you know just how true that is. It just rises up, and then it blows away, and then it rises up and blows away, but the word of the Lord remains forever, that's our standard. And so in the midst of that, in the midst of these shifting beliefs, we are called to be people of conviction. So I want to just kind of differentiate between the word belief and conviction. So belief, if we could define it this way, belief is an acceptance of truth, right? It's this cognitive acknowledgement that this over here, that this is true, that I realize it. It's a recognition that this is true. That's belief. But conviction kind of goes a step beyond that, because conviction, if we could define it like this, is a demonstration, right? So belief is a recognition. Conviction is a demonstration of the recognition. It's a demonstration of a firmly held belief. In other words, it's lived out. It's not just something that we've cognitively accepted. It's something that we are basing our life around. And so, the question is, how do you know? How do you know if it's a belief or conviction? Well, these Christians are finding out, right? Like when people mock you, when they make fun of you, you find out, is it a belief or is it a conviction? Because there's some things we think are convictions, but then we start to experience some pressure, maybe from family, maybe some friends. We've experienced this pressure, and it turns out it's not much of a conviction. It's really more a belief. And we just kind of go quiet with it. And here's how Howard Hendricks defines it. He says, a belief is something you'll argue about, but a conviction is something you die for. And Peter's writing to Christians who are going to die for their convictions. And there's going to be this tendency to want to abandon them, just kind of acquiesce, go along with what everyone else says. And so he warns them that when they live out their convictions, look, when you are a person of conviction, you're going to do things differently. And when you do things differently, a lot of people won't like it. Like, as long as you just kind of keep your beliefs to yourself and just believe them, then no one really minds. You believe what you want to believe. But the moment you start to live out your beliefs, the moment you become a person of conviction, then it feels like an indictment on other people. And so a lot of people don't like it. He talks about this. Peter writes in chapter 4, of course your former friends, the people you used to kind of hang out with, of course they're surprised when you no longer plunge into the flood of wild and destructive things that they do. So look, what do? They slander you. But remember, Peter says, that they will have to face God, who stands ready to judge everyone, both the living and the dead. So keep that in mind. And so increasingly, here's the tension for us. You know, if we just get down to where we live, the tension is we are called to be convicted and to be compassionate, but oftentimes those values are presented as contrary to one another. That if you're convicted, if you believe that this is true and you believe these things aren't true, that doesn't make you very compassionate, it doesn't make you a very loving person. If you say, this is what I believe this is true, I don't think that's true, then that gets labeled as, our convictions get labeled as intolerant, right? Intolerant. It's the word that gets thrown around a lot lately. Tolerance in the dictionary is defined this way: to recognize and respect others' beliefs, practices, etc., and this is important, without sharing them. Without sharing them. Yeah, okay. This is the right kind of tolerance. It's the tolerance that Jesus modeled, that I can respect a person, I can care about a person, I can value a person, and I can still think that they're wrong. That's okay. Like, I don't have to agree with them. And so Jesus was constantly doing this. As a Jewish man, he violated all kinds of social practices in an effort to be tolerant, to reach out to other people that others were not. The problem is that these days, when the word tolerance is used, this is according to the book, The New Tolerance, about 80% of the time, when you hear the word tolerance, it's better understood, or more accurately translated for our time, is every individual's beliefs, values, lifestyle, and perception of truth claims are equal, which is ridiculous, right? That, I believe this is true, and you believe that's true, but these two truths contradict each other, but they're still both true. No, that is not intellectually honest. If you believe one thing and I believe something else, and those things contradict each other, then by definition, one of them can't be true. And yet, that is increasingly how this is presented. That it's not enough just to show respect to someone else who has different beliefs, but you can't say, well, this is true and this isn't true. And when Christians talk like that, they start to have some abuse heaped upon them. They get called names, intolerant, bigoted, narrow-minded, prejudiced. No one likes to be called names. Like, no one enjoys that. And so when we're called names, we don't want to be vilified, and we don't want to be marginalized, and we don't want to be ostracized. And so what you're seeing is a lot of churches and Christians as well who are acquiescing on their convictions. And so they'll reinterpret Scripture to match up with what is culturally popular. It kind of works out nice for them. Because it just so turns out that what they believed to be true changed exactly at the same time it became unpopular to believe it. And Paul talks about this. He warns Timothy about it in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. He says, look, the time is coming. Don't be surprised when this happens, because the time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching, but they'll follow their own desires, and they'll look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear. So throughout 1 Peter, the Christians are called to be people of strong conviction, even when it costs them something. But then there's also this strong call to be people of compassion. And these things get pitted against each other. That, okay, if I have this conviction, it means I got to be angry. And the more angry and the stronger language I use, the more passionate and upset I become, the more convicted I must be. And so if I have a strong enough conviction, then it turns into an us versus them approach to our beliefs. And we start to make people who believe differently than we do or live differently than we do, the very people we're called to love, right? We start making them into the enemy, the opposition. And when that happens, the real enemy wins. See, as Christians, we're called to have conviction. Absolutely. But how are we to be known by the outside world? By our convictions? More than by our convictions, we are to be known by our what? We need to get this one right. They will know that you are my disciples by your love. Yeah, that's the right answer. There's a big problem when we are known by the outside world more for our convictions than our compassion. Does that mean we set aside convictions? No, absolutely not. But it does mean that we should be known for our love. Jesus talked about this. I just quoted a piece of it in John 13. A new command I give you, Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. He says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples, that you are my followers, if you love one another. So more than these doctrines, more than our arguments, it's our love for one another. Go back a slide real quick here. Jesus says it's a new command. He says, new command I give you, love one another. Jesus, read the Old Testament. That's not a new command. It's not a new command. Well, here's what makes it new. Jesus says, as I have loved you. So he comes on the scene and he redefines it. It's a whole new command. That's how radically he redefined love, by the people that he loved and the way that he loved them. He says it's a whole new way to think about this. Peter talks about this kind of love and compassion that should mark our lives in an increasingly hostile culture. 1 Peter 3:8, finally, he says, as I get ready to wrap this up, kind of enter into the final section of my letter, finally, all of you be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult or Facebook post with Facebook post. On the contrary, he says, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, that you may inherit a blessing. Repay evil with blessing. 1 Peter 4:8 and 9. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Verse 9, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. The word hospitality is a compound word in the original language. It means love strangers. Love those who aren't a part of your group. 1 Peter 2:15, for it is God's will that by doing good, by these acts of kindness, of generosity, good, by doing good, you will silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. That's God's will. That as his people living in this culture, that by doing good, kindness, generosity, by doing good, we will silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Well, yeah, but I've made up these signs. And I thought we could just march around with megaphones because they make you sound loud and intimidating. What if we tried that? Well, we've tried that. What if we tried this? What if we try what the Bible says? What if instead we love each other deeply? What if instead we show radical acts of kindness and generosity? And that's how we're known. Here's the way we could say it. When people begin to witness our compassion, they will begin to care about our convictions. Right? If they have our convictions without our compassion, we do more harm than good, really. We just push people further away. If they see our conviction, but we're not known for our compassion, then we're doing the opposite of drawing them in. We're pushing them away. Their walls go up. Their hearts get hard. But when they see our compassion, they'll begin to care about our conviction, that is the way that we live out our faith in this culture. See, it's easy to agree with someone who agrees with you. It's easy to be respectful to someone who is respectful to you. It's easy to love someone who's loving towards you. But what we have is an opportunity to live out a new command. And the more people don't like you, the more opportunity you have to live out the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated. Peter talks about this in chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. He talks about the example Jesus left for us in this in this way. He says, "For God called you to do good." Again, kindness, generosity is that word. "Even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you." He is your example. Jesus is your example. And you must follow in his steps. He never sinned. He never deceived anyone. Verse 23, he didn't retaliate when he was insulted. I could have. And it says that he didn't threaten revenge when he suffered. He didn't say, "Wait until I get back up in heaven. Just wait. You're not going to believe what's going to fall upon you when I get back in heaven." He doesn't start threatening. Instead, it says he left the case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. Now, if he can do that, then do you think God needs our help? So the Message paraphrases it this way: they called him every name in the book, but he didn't say anything back. He suffered in silence, content to let God set things right. Can we just remember that, please? I mean, next time that we are tempted to retaliate, can we just kind of remember the fact that Jesus didn't do that? Next time we're tempted to trade insult for insult and one punch for another punch, can we just for a moment remember that Jesus on the cross prayed, "Father, forgive them"? Before you go on your next social media rant, can you just push pause long enough to remember how Jesus handled some of these things? Can we just be content to let God set some things right? See, the early church flourished, I believe, because under intense persecution, they let their love and compassion silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. New York Times editorialist Nicholas Kristof wrote a column praising the work of many evangelical Christians. He says, evangelicals are disproportionately likely to donate 10% of their incomes to charities, mostly church-related. More important, they're disproportionately likely to go to the front lines at home or abroad in the battles against hunger, malaria, prison, rape, human trafficking, and genocide. And he says some of the bravest people you meet are evangelical Christians who truly live in their faith. He says, listen to this, I'm not particularly religious myself, but I stand in awe of those I've seen risking their lives in this way, and it sickens me to see that faith mocked at New York cocktail parties. He sees the compassion. He sees the love. He's not particularly religious, but how do you argue with it? There's something different. I've spoken before about a book by Rodney Stark, who at the time when he wrote it was a professor of sociology and comparative religions at the University of Washington. The book is called The Rise of Early Christianity, How an Obscure Marginal Jesus Movement changed the world. And he tracks Christianity through the first 300 years or so, where there's this intense persecution, but then the church exploded. I mean, how is that possible? And he gives some different examples. For one, he talks about how abortion, specifically infanticide, was common in the Greco-Roman world, and it was an accepted practice that was usually exercised when the child was female or had physical disabilities. And it was just perfectly common for an unwanted child to simply be placed in the woods for wild animals to find, or a strange and perverted people to come along and retrieve. It was true of almost all deformed babies. They had some physical deformity. They were simply abandoned. But the early Christians said, no, we're not going to do it that way. And in fact, they didn't just practice that within their community. They went out into the woods and they found the children that had been left, and they raised the children in their homes. And this is how the very first orphanages are established in the homes of Christians. The church valued women and they protected children in a culture that did neither. Christian men were called in the church to love their wives as equal partners. Peter does this in 1 Peter chapter 3. He says, husbands, love your wives as equal partners. We read that and we're like, well, yeah. At that time, when he wrote those words, that was completely foreign and utterly ridiculed, the thought. So when the church began to take care of each other, they didn't just take care of each other, they took care of people outside their community. So, for example, widows at that time were typically forced to remarry because they didn't have a way to provide for themselves, but the church came in and told the widows, we'll figure this out together. You don't have to remarry. We'll help take care of you. Another example, in early Rome, young ladies would often be forced to marry even before puberty. But the church came in and said, we're not going to do that. We're going to do things differently. The list just goes on. And eventually, here's the thing. Eventually, this very, Rome, that is, when Peter writes this, is persecuting Christians so intentionally, eventually becomes a Christian nation. So how did that happen? It was love. It was the compassion that lived it out. Now here's what's fascinating. You can trace this. So when Rome becomes Christian, when they go from winning the world through love to winning the world through power, it falls apart. Like, I'm sure there were many Christians and many churches who thought, finally we have an emperor who wants to make sure everybody does what God says. And so Christianity began to try to influence the world not through love, but through power by saying, look, you got to do it. You got to do it. You know who the emperor is? We've got the numbers. This is what we say goes. This is what you got to do. And the moment Christianity trades love for power, it loses. One of the best places for Christianity to thrive and to flourish is in a place where it doesn't have the mantle of power on it. Because when we trade love for power as the way to influence the world, it doesn't work. Last week we talked about how Christians are, as foreigners and as exiles, are called to live these holy lives. But Peter in chapter 2 explains it. He says, look, you're called to live this way. You're called to live different. We saw this last week. Because you've tasted that the Lord is good. Like, you know that. You know about his love, and you know about his grace, you know about his mercy. You've tasted and seen that the Lord is good. Because you know that, the spirit should be, hey, well, what does God want from me? I want to honor him. After everything he's done for me, after the reward that I know I have in heaven, I trust him with my life. I've tasted and seen that the Lord is good. But when we try to force people through power to live a certain way who haven't tasted and seen that the Lord is good, it falls apart. I was thinking about this past week as I was walking through the mall. I was going through the food court, and I was kind of in a hurry. I really wasn't hungry, but as I was walking by one of the Asian food places, there was a guy that was handing out samples. You know what I'm talking about. They got the plate with the chicken and the toothpicks. And so he's handing out samples, and I don't really want any, but right as I'm walking by, he has a toothpick piece of chicken. He sticks it out for me to take it. Now, I didn't want it. Frankly, it was a little bit annoying, but it's hard to get mad at people who are handing out free food just as a general rule. Like, you look kind of foolish if somebody's trying to do something nice for you and you act frustrated and annoyed. So I took the chicken, and without really thinking too much about it, I ate it. It was good. It was good. And so then I looked at my clock, and I'm like, I was in a hurry, but I need nourishment. Everybody needs nourishment. And really, as much as the more I've got to do, the more I probably need to just stop and eat some food. And so I go back, and before I really know what's happened, I'm sitting down eating a plate full of that chicken. And look, we are surrounded by people who don't believe what we believe, who don't really care about some of God's standards. They didn't sign up for them. But it's our job as Christians to walk around, handing out samples. Letting people taste and see his kindness and his goodness and his love. Well, what would happen if we did that? If that was our mentality, where we just kind of walked around school and we walked around work and we walked around the neighborhood, we just had our plate with toothpicks, handing out samples. We just always had a sample ready. And some of you got a person in your life, and you're like, well, that's not going to work. He wants to turn everything into a debate. I just need to prove him wrong. And you got somebody in your life who just doesn't care, doesn't show any interest. Here's what I'm telling you, that at some point, the empty life, as Peter calls it in chapter 1, the empty life will leave him hungry. I don't know when, but it'll happen. A lot of you know that. And if one of you just happens to be in their life at that time with a plate of samples, it could change everything. See, we blame the decline of our culture on all sorts of things. I mean, it's just easier to blame other people, right? So we blame elected officials and activist judges and unconstitutional rulings and secular entertainment, and we've got our list. But you got to wonder, I mean, what if we actually did this stuff? I mean, what if we put the same amount of energy into actually just doing this, of living this and loving in this way? You have to wonder what kind of impact that might have. If the church just was sacrificially caring for poor and needy people in extravagant ways. I mean, what if the church just cared for orphans and the fatherless? What if they just relentlessly reached out and cared for single moms in need? I mean, what if we just said, hey, we're going to do this? You have to wonder what kind of impact that might have.